I'm fired up and I'm ready to go. I'm fired up and I'm ready to go. I'm fired up and I'm ready to go. This is the Billionaire Brown experience. Let's go. What's your story and how did you arrive to this calling that you have?
Yeah, my story. In 1990, that goes back to then. That's when my healing journey began. And I needed to get some help because I was having a really hard time. I was just freshly in college. And I went to a 12-step program, actually. And it was called CODA, Codependence Anonymous, because I had a problem. I was too much looking out there to get all my validation from people. And I had a really hard time just being with myself. So I went to meeting after meeting, and I pretty quickly got that this is my new path. This is my family. And I started sponsoring people in that program. And that is sometimes where I think some of the best education comes in terms of helping people with their issues. The 12-step programs are an incredible training ground to help others. And that evolved from there. I sponsored lots of people, and then I started speaking in meetings all up and down Los Angeles. And it seemed a little ridiculous at first. A 20-year-old is talking to people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s about relationship difficulty. But I had kind of a knack for it right off the bat. And I would say the thing that I had mostly was a whole lot of suffering behind me that led me to understanding people's pain and their hurt and their frustrations very deeply. And I had a way of helping them. So that led to other things in different groups. And I became, an assistant teacher in other groups. And now what I would say 28 years later, is that it led me right to couples. And also I run a women's group. So I help marriages. I help save marriages regularly. And I run a women's group. Right now there's about 46 people in it. And we get on live calls like this, and we have 7, 8, 9, 10 women on the screen at the same time, and we're going through everything, how they do relationships, how they do dating, how they do marriages, and we learn a lot together. So I'm really grateful.
Okay, awesome. The question everybody's probably asking you is, how successful is your relationship?
How successful is my relationship? I've been dating a woman right now for a while, and we have just absolutely beautiful communication. It works
a while.
Amazingly. This has been about a year-long relationship.
Okay.
Yes. And what I would say is I had a marriage. I had a 10-year marriage, and that marriage actually created some of the most beautiful clarity of my life. It led me directly to working with couples because I actually myself was in marriage counseling with my wife and recognized that I want more out of a connection. I really, I teach this to people, I help people, and I finally slowed myself down enough to recognize I'm not able to go deeper in this relationship. And instead of, kind of doing what most couples do and arguing and fighting and trying to get her to change, I went and saw some real expert therapists myself. And after doing that, my wife and I actually saw a couple, 2 therapists, a married couple, and they helped me really realize that I couldn't have this deeper craving that I was wanting. And so I had to get divorced. It was very painful at the time, but it was some of my greatest learning of my life to, move me forward.
But was it that clear and simple as you're saying? Like, because normally it doesn't work out that way.
Right.
Was it very simple? You went to the counselor or therapist or the expert and they told you, they sat down with you, they worked with you guys, and then it was like, oh yeah, I can't go any deeper in this relationship. And she said, oh, okay, you can't go any deeper. And that was it? Or was there some?
That's a really great question. So what was definitely not simple was my heart, and what was not simple was her heart and the hurting around all of this. That was very complicated. But I will tell you, we went to about 4 sessions that lasted anywhere from an hour and a half to 3 hours. And, I remember in the very last session, I said something that I was upset about, and my wife gave her answer. And it took both therapists kind of getting behind my wife, and they were saying to her, Derek just expressed something that was difficult, and he's not attacking you, and he's not putting you down. And what he would really like to do is to be able to sometimes say when things are upsetting for him, and he would like you to just listen without defending yourself. And basically, the therapist kind of looked at me and said, this is not going to happen in this relationship. You will not get to have this with this particular partner. So she tried so hard to do this. So this took me several months to kind of get out of denial about and recognize that I'm not going to get to have this kind of closeness that I want. So no, it wasn't simple. But in that last session, when the therapist looked at me and said, there's nothing more we can do here. She's going to continue being defensive with you, and we have not, in 10 hours of work, been able to penetrate that.
Okay, so when you're talking about defensive, what do we mean by defensive? Is it like, was that just the main theme? Like just you say something and then there's some defense to it? Or was it sometimes? Was it literally like all the time? Like you say you have an issue with something and there was some defense to it? Or was it kind of like a give and take, but?
Good question. Yeah. So I was not, all the time presenting things I was upset about. This is something that happens. I mean, towards the end of the relationship, it was happening, let's say, twice a week. I would need to say something. And I think that defensiveness is it's one of the top 3 things I work with all the time. When I would say, I'll give you a specific example. When I would say to her, I'm really sad that I'm not connecting with my stepdaughter. Okay, that was actually her daughter. That was my stepdaughter. We raised these 2 children for 10 years together. And if I would say, I'm really upset, I'm not connecting with my stepdaughter, what she would hear is that I don't love her daughter. What she would hear is that she's a flawed mother. What she would hear is she's doing something wrong because I'm upset. Okay. Now she couldn't accurately get clear on that in her head. She would just have that type of thing happening. Obviously, that's my analysis of what was going on with her. And that's when she would respond what I call defensively. And we would then argue. And the only point was that I wanted to be listened to for being upset and have some empathy coming towards me, which never happened. So I would begin convincing her and trying to teach her to do that for me. That doesn't work. If you're in a relationship, you cannot be each other's counselors. It doesn't work. That's why I sought help.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen that are just tuning in, this is Derek Hart from understandingeachother.com. Derek, I want to know, you went to 4 sessions, right?
Yeah.
And at what point did this get revealed in the session?
Well, what I would talk about in the sessions was almost exactly what I just told you. I try to explain something. I try to express myself. I want to be heard, and she can't hear me. She won't listen. She thinks I'm always criticizing her and telling her that she's doing something wrong. And I believe I am making no mention of her at all in what I'm sharing. So it started very early in the sessions what the presenting problem was. And we worked on that over and over and over. And by that final last session, I remember the 2 therapists were literally sitting behind her, whispering in her ear, Derek hasn't attacked you, and nothing has happened where he said you've done anything wrong. And sometimes he even says things you're doing right just to try to get you to respond more positively. So we tried all the way to the end to understand each other about that. We couldn't get there.
Is that called something? Is that called something? Did through the sessions or through your research and all of that, is that called something what she was dealing with, and is that called something what you weren't able to receive?
Yeah, that's interesting. Is that called something? That is called, there's not a specific term that I would use for it other than that's what, almost every person I've ever met has some kind of defense system when they feel attacked or criticized. So it kind of makes sense to defend yourself. But when that happens too often in a relationship, it is the start of almost every argument. Every single couple that actually comes here into this room and works with me, the way it works, even though all the stories are so different, the way it works is almost always the same. One person says something that's upsetting for them, and then it begins an argument because the other person doesn't hear it. So then they defend themselves. So then the other person starts trying to convince them to listen. And that's the start of every argument. So slowing that process down is what I help people do. Slowing it down to, the first couple sentences that come out of your mouth when you're saying what's bothering you are usually the full truth. And when a couple then goes into a 2, 3, 4, 5 hour argument after that first sentence that was the truth, that's what happens. I mean, couples actually sometimes show up to their first session here after they've been up for 8 hours arguing. And then I asked them, what was the first thing that was said? And the very first thing that was said was the truth. So I asked them to actually say that right now to the other person and have the other person kind of remain silent for a moment to actually hear that's the problem. So slowing it down, in between the arguing is actually where the substance is of what they're fighting about. They're never actually fighting about the thing they think they're fighting about. They're fighting about the fact that they don't feel safe to explain what they're feeling and be listened to with compassion. That's always almost always the fight.
Okay, so I'm curious to know, have you ever had to give the same advice that your therapist had to give to you at your sessions right there in that room? Have you ever had to, you have?
Oh, almost all the time. I would say, I ask some very...
Wait, you know the advice that I'm talking about? I'm talking about the advice of, this is not going to ever change.
Correct.
Oh, wow.
Yes. I ask a few questions in the very first session that are really telling. So I'll tell you a couple interesting things. A couple questions I ask the couple are, first of all, are you attracted to each other sexually? I'm not saying right now when they're at each other's throats fighting, but from the beginning of the relationship, were they attracted to each other? Hopefully the answer is yes. When the answer is no, we always kind of had a problem with that. Then we have a really tough path ahead of us. The other question I ask them is, how much did they have that in-love experience in the beginning? And when they actually don't even have that at the core, we have a long road ahead of us. So those are two very important questions. However, I would say about 15%, not 20, but about 15% of couples, I know within about an hour, sometimes 2 hours of work, that one of them is open to changing and hearing things they're doing that are causing difficulty and shifting it, because I teach vulnerability. I teach them how to be vulnerable. And I see sometimes one partner getting that and the other partner not getting that. So I'm not here to spend 1.5 years in counseling with them to just have them do the work and pay fees. I'm actually here to help them recognize that pretty quickly. And sometimes I do directly have to say, this is not going to change unless the one partner wants to shift. And I lay it out very